The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored, because it cannot survive their being repeated. That four great nations, flushed with victory and stung with injury, stay the hand of vengeance and voluntarily submit their captive enemies to the judgment of the law is one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason.
On November 21, 1945, Robert H. Jackson delivered these famous, powerful lines in his opening statement at the first international trials in history, the Nuremberg trials. The unimaginable devastation of World War II had shocked and horrified the world. The atrocities committed by the Nazis were unforgivable, and the world responded by pleading for the execution of the Nazi leaders. Yet the Allies chose a different option, something far more revolutionary. They chose true justice. They chose to conduct a fair trial. The Nuremberg trials reformed the human rights movement, medical practice, the accountability of businesses, and the concept of international trials and justice. Before the Nuremberg trials, attempts to establish and reform fixed rules of war and international justice were largely unsuccessful. Following the looting and other forms of civilian maltreatment that occurred during the 30 Years' War in Europe, the need for international warfare regulations was clear. In response, Hugo Grotius, a Dutch philosopher, published On the Law of War and Peace, in which he examined international laws, traditional customs of war, and the role of non-combative citizens in war. The idea of the rights of non-combative citizens was expanded upon during the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907. These two international treaties sought to improve the treatment of prisoners of war, eliminate the use of deleterious gases, establish the right of neutral powers, and regulate sea warfare. However, these treaties were not enforced. After World War I, the desire for international justice resurfaced. Cries of "Hang the Kaiser" poured in from across the world, influencing the victors to create Article 228 of the Versailles Treaty, allowing the Allied powers the right to try persons accused of having committed acts in violations of the laws and customs of war. Although these trials were conducted, they were ineffective in reforming international justice. In the following years, there were several other attempts at reforming international war guidelines, such as the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928, which promised to condemn recourse to war for the solution of international controversies. However, this pact clearly failed to reform warfare and failed to prevent the deadliest war in history. During World War II, the Allied countries gradually became aware of the inhumane acts committed by the Nazis and were outraged. At first, the Allied leaders called for execution by firing squad after a summary hearing. However, U.S. Secretary of War Henry Stimson pushed for a trial system in order to document the Holocaust and establish the U.S. as the moral leader of the world. President Truman agreed and appointed Robert Jackson to the job. Jackson was adamant in his revolutionary belief that anyone, including the inhumane Nazis, deserved the right to a trial. He convinced the Allied powers to create the Charter of the International Military Tribunal in order to set up the Nuremberg trials. Jackson insisted on 4 specific charges: conspiracy to wage aggressive war, waging aggressive war crimes, and crimes against humanity. After much persuasion, these charges were agreed on, 24 defendants were named, and the trials commenced on October 18, 1945 in the German city of Nuremberg. In Jackson's closing statement, he spoke for the world when he asked that the defendants be found guilty.
If you were to say of these men that they are not guilty, it would be as true to say that there has been no war, that there are no slain, that there has been no crime.
Following the main trial, 12 additional trials were conducted against professionals, industrialists and financiers, SS officers, military leaders, and government ministers. These supplementary trials expanded the scope of war crimes beyond the battlefield. For example, the medical case tried 23 German doctors for performing brutal experiments on unwilling patients. The Krupp case tried infamous industry owner Alfred Krupp and 12 of his executives for use of slave labor in the factories and the looting of foreign property. Nuremberg has contributed to reforms in the human rights movement, medical regulations, the accountability of international businesses, and the overall concept of international trials and justice. The Nuremberg trials reformed the human rights movement simply by creating the charge of crimes against humanity. As defined in Article 6 of the London Charter, crimes against humanity are inhuman acts committed against any civilian population, whether or not in violation of the domestic law of the country where perpetrated. This established a revolutionary idea, that human beings have international rights that supersede any nation's laws. Nuremberg's invention of crimes against humanity inspired many other human rights reforms, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, issued by the United Nations, and the Geneva Convention No. 3, which establishes the rules of the treatment of prisoners. The Nuremberg trials also led to pivotal reforms through the establishment of the Nuremberg Code as a set of research ethics for the world. This code requires the voluntary and informed consent of all research participants. Experimentation must avoid all unnecessary suffering and injury and be conducted by scientifically qualified people. The Krupp case of the Nuremberg trials reformed the way that international businesses are held accountable. Through the trial of industrialist Alfred Krupp, 4 important principles were established. That individuals can be held accountable for business practices. Actions of private corporations will face international scrutiny. No profit justifies illegal practices, and a business owner can be found guilty if he or she benefits from a violation of human rights. The most significant reform of the Nuremberg trials was the expansion of the concept of international justice. Jackson established every individual has a right to a fair trial and the assumption of innocence. With that idea, he also reformed the way the actions of leaders are viewed. Through the Nuremberg trials, the international community has declared that leaders can and will be held accountable for their actions. The Nuremberg trials spawned a revolutionary tide of international courts, starting with the Tokyo Charter, which was created to try the Japanese war criminals of World War II. There have also been trials for crimes against humanity in Yugoslavia, Rwanda, and Sierra Leone. On April 26, 2012, the Special Court for Sierra Leone found former Liberian President Charles Taylor guilty of 11 counts of aiding and abetting war crimes and crimes against humanity. Taylor was the first head of state to be found guilty in an international court since the Nuremberg trials. In addition to these courts, an independent permanent court called the International Criminal Court has been established in The Hague. This court utilizes the Nuremberg principles of the due process, presumption of innocence, and the non-immunity of government leaders to try people for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Although the Nuremberg trials created widespread reform, there is still some controversy about resistance to the acceptance of these principles into U.S. law. There is controversy and debate over the idea that the United States' reputation as a defender of international justice has declined through the events of Guantanamo Bay. After 9/11, the U.S. violated the Nuremberg principles by imprisoning many suspected terrorists without informing of their crimes, torturing the prisoners, and denying them right to a fair trial, if any at all. The U.S. has also resisted the Nuremberg reforms by refusing to join, financially support, or help improve the ICC. There is some debate over the constitutionality of submitting our citizens to the jurisdiction of an international court. Others find this view hypocritical, because the U.S. was instrumental in establishing the principle that no country is immune to international law. The ICC was designed to provide a moral compass by which the world can judge war crimes and crimes against humanity. The U.S. should be supporting, not sabotaging, the creation of an international institution. We should be offering moral leadership, not violating our own principles. Every country deserves equal protection before the law, and no nation should be above the law. The atrocities of World War II demonstrated the unimaginable capacity of human evil. The world was infuriated and could have easily reacted by perpetuating the violence and injustice through the brutal execution of the Nazi leaders. Yet a revolutionary decision was made to uphold justice and not withhold the basic human right to a fair trial. The legacy of these remarkable trials is the reformation of international justice. However, we should not and cannot forget the lessons of Nuremberg.